Hi, folks. I'm Jason. Welcome to Filmography Club. Today, we wrap up our season-long mission of covering the English language work of Denis Villeneuve, which means that in this episode, we're talking about Dune Part One, the 2021 film directed, of course, by Villeneuve. Screenplay by John Spates, Denis Villeneuve himself, and Eric Roth. Cinematography by Greg Fraser. Edited by Joe Walker, and music by Hans Zimmer. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Rodgers, a native Nashvillian. He's worked at the Nashville Scene for 13 years. Before making the move to editor-in-chief in 2017, he served as music listings editor, calendar editor, music editor, and managing editor, writing and editing film, music, culture, and news features and criticism. He's contributed to Vice, Rolling Stone, In Focus, Ion Magazine, Garden and Gun, and Spin, among others, and he studied both film and journalism. He also writes some fiction, plays a few instruments, mostly the drums, and lives with his dog, Ernie, who he describes as a delightful idiot. Got a couple of those myself. Oh, and be aware, Filmography Club is not a spoiler-free podcast, so we do get into spoilers for not only this movie, but for the entire novel, which means that we're going to be spoiling Dune Part 2, the upcoming sequel. So just be aware of that. So now I present to you my talk with Patrick Rodgers about the 2021 adaptation of the best-selling science fiction novel of all time, Dune Part One. And I'm joined by Patrick Rodgers. Patrick.
Hello, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're here to talk about Denis Villeneuve's latest work. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call it Dune Part One.
There you
That's
go.
what the title card says. I know all the marketing just says Dune, but I think they're going to retroactively retitle this one Dune Part One once Part Two comes out. I have that feeling. So you're a big Dune fan, to my understanding, and you're also a big Denis Villeneuve fan.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Tell me about your relationship with his work when you first came across it. And also, I guess I'm asking you two questions at once. I'd like you to talk to me about Dune and when you first ran into that and your relationship with its various iterations.
I want to say that the first of his films I saw was Prisoners. Hard to say. Obviously, you've been going through the filmography, so you can tell me what year did that one come out? Was that 20?
I want to say it was 13.
13? Okay, I was going to say 12, maybe. Yeah, somewhere in there.
There's a little confusion on my end about whether Enemy or Prisoners was released first, because I think that they were released in opposite order. Like the one was filmed first, but it got a wide release after the other.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think that's right, but I'm not 100% on that.
Well, I recall seeing that around when it came out, and just sort of started tracking his career. Loved Sicario, and that's when I was like, okay, let me go all in on this guy. What's his deal? And also, I'm a huge Blade Runner fan, so was excited that he was picking up in 2049. Was really pleased with that film. I loved it. A lot of people have mixed feelings about it. I often have mixed feelings about this sort of late revisitation sequel, but I thought he just handled that one, just did a wonderful job. He didn't exactly recapture what Ridley Scott did with Blade Runner, but that's not exactly what he was trying to do. So I thought, this is a guy who can kind of interpret material in a unique way, but keep the thread going. So that's when I really I was like, okay, I'm sold on this guy. So the second I found out he was developing Dune, I was pretty excited. Now, I had not read Dune at that point when it was first announced. I had seen David Lynch's Dune a couple of times. I'm a big David Lynch fan as well. And that's a pretty odd one in his filmography for many reasons that maybe we'll get into. But, loved it, was kind of intrigued by the universe, by the world building, but still hadn't, outside of, sort of general pop culture references to it, hadn't really dug into Dune. But when I found out that he was going to direct the adaptation, I decided to sort of dive into the book series in earnest and read the first two books, revisited the David Lynch version, and listened to a lot of podcasts and I'm a little bit of a, I'm sure you can't identify with this at all, but I'm a little bit of a nerd. When I get into something, I sort of go all in. Yeah. And my poor girlfriend had to listen to me talking about the universe of Dune for a few months there. So just kind of exploring the universe and all that. But yeah, just really started getting into the books themselves and reading about that universe really a year back, actually now that it's March, maybe a little bit more. During the pandemic, I was like, all right, what can I dig into? And Dune was it.
Okay. So you've read the first 2 novels so far.
Yes.
You plan on
and
going
I'm kind
further?
of, I may read the third. I doubt I'll dive. Well, one day I probably will. I probably won't read any of the sort of later era, any that his son wrote. But and I'm also pretty aware of the plot that continues after the first 3, just from listening to podcasts and reading. Same here. Things. So I know where it goes, and I think it's kind of amazing and fantastic how really deeply weird it gets. And I'm wondering if the series with Villeneuve or anybody else continues, how far down the path, the golden path, they'll go with the weirdness.
Right.
But I'm pretty familiar with how it ends up in at least the first 4, 5, 6 books, something like that.
Yeah, I know some of the broad strokes, but I'm still working on the novel. I opened it a little while ago, but I've just been busy with other stuff, and I come back to it when I can.
It's dense. It's a dense read, and I love it, but it's not like a zippy. You'll find yourself reading and rereading paragraphs. I remember when I first started writing, and I felt like I read the first 10 pages 20 times over just to make sure I was. But then you sort of get with the pace of it, and it's really fun to sort of enter that world after the first. It's split into the 3 books. The book itself has the 3 parts, rather. By the end of that first one, I think I kind of got the pace of it. Yeah,
I'm enjoying it. But I like I said, I know the broad strokes about where the universe is going. I know that there were, I believe, Herbert himself wrote the first 5 novels in the sequel.
Sounds right. Thereabouts.
And they all take place like thousands of years apart from one another.
To some extent. I mean, the first 2, so Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, those first 3, I don't think it's a span of thousands. I think especially the second book doesn't jump that far forward. But as it goes along, it does span a really, really long time. And that's something that I appreciate about the work that also Asimov does, like with the Foundation series, just covering a huge amount of time, which you don't really see in much sci-fi or anything.
It's just breathtaking how much went into this, and the breadth of it is just...
Oh, I mean, Frank Herbert.
Very impressive.
That's kind of what's like intoxicating about the series is how his world building, the lore that he creates around it, how everything feels built in. It almost feels like you're dropping into a universe that existed even with the first book for, you could swear that this is the 5th or 10th or 20th book in a series, especially since it starts, millennia in the future in our millennia from now in our world.
Yeah, it starts out on year 10,000 something, but I don't even know if they're using the Gregorian calendar or if they've moved on to something else. And
there's nerdier folks than I, which I guess is really saying something, who have broken that down a little bit as to whether it's technically like 10,000 AD or not. And, I'm sure that, somebody could correct me, but I think it's some roughly like 8,000 years in the future or thereabouts.
Yeah. And then by the end of it, I think we're somewhere in the year, what we would consider to be the year like 35,000, but they're on some other calendar.
Yeah, it goes deep, deep, deep into the future. And, he's covering generations and generations of folks. So yeah, just even to have that capacity for imagination as an author, I think is really cool.
But yeah, to answer your question earlier, Prisoners and Enemy both released in 2013.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Prisoners first, but I think it was filmed after Enemy.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And then I feel like, I want to say Sicario was like 2015.
Yep. 2015. Yeah. The next year was Arrival. Yeah, he did 3 in a row, 3 years in a row. Sicario, Arrival, Blade Runner, 2049.
Blade Runner, yeah. And I didn't mention Arrival, but I was a huge fan of Arrival. I think that's even more than, sorry, I don't mean to get off what we're talking about right now, but I think even more than Blade Runner, Arrival is when I clicked in with him and really started paying attention to his career and watching him.
I think it was that one and Sicario. Discovered both of those movies right around the same time, and they both just blew me away, especially Sicario. Now, Arrival did too.
But they're both so uniquely their own films. He does sort of have a visual style, the way he sets up shots and that sort of thing. But as far as well, literally the subject matter, but then just the character, the framing. I mean, he can do all kinds of things. Yeah.
Very versatile. Yeah. Prisoners, when you describe that to somebody, it's a heavy drama, and yet it looks like a Villeneuve movie. Enemy, just this weird head trip. He does have certain visual hallmarks. The book's great, or at least so far it is.
Gets better and better.
I did what Villeneuve wanted me to do, and I got up off my couch and I went into a theater for the first time in 2 years and watched it in IMAX the way he wanted us to watch it. Gigantic IMAX image. The sound, I mean, it was shaking. My guts were shaking.
Yeah. The scope is just overwhelming.
Scope and the scale. Yeah.
I did as well. I did the IMAX thing on my first viewing, and I watched it a couple weeks later on HBO Max.
You know, he got the right cinematographer for this one, too. They almost had Roger Deakins, but I think he backed out for whatever reason.
Deakins did Blade Runner with them, though.
He did,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And Sicario.
And Sicario, okay.
Oh, and Prisoners, as a matter of fact. Yeah, he did, did all three of those. The cinematography was done by, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. His last name is Fraser. Greg, or maybe Grieg. There's an I in there, E-I-G.
Okay.
I'm going to call him Greg Fraser. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, sir. I remember the first time I noticed his work was on that Star Wars movie he did. Was it Rogue One?
That sounds right.
Yeah, he did. And I didn't like Rogue One, but I thought it looked fantastic. And the sense of scale that they put into it was pretty impressive. The scenes with the big walkers, the AT-AT walkers, and the guys on the ground running towards them while taking fire. I'd never seen that in a Star Wars movie. And it felt like those big, gigantic walkers were actually big, gigantic machines. And that was the first time I'd really seen that kind of scale in a Star Wars movie, and I was really impressed with it. In fact, that was the only thing I had nice to say about that movie was the cinematography. I was like, wow, this movie looks like a legit movie, even though the script is garbage.
That's funny you say that. I enjoyed it, but I also kind of like the framing of it as sort of like almost like a South Pacific war movie with the sort of, espionage intrigue. I thought that was interesting. I thought, there's a lot in the Star Wars pantheon that I'm finding more and more unnecessary as time goes by. But I enjoyed the experience of watching it when it came out.
The cinematographer did a great job on that. He's clearly does a lot of good work with scale, and this movie really drives that home. The sense of scale is just jaw-dropping.
I'm glad it translated, because it's not something that, even though I adore David Lynch, and I love a lot of the things he did with his version of Dune. Impossible to capture the scale, in my opinion, impossible to capture the just how villainous Harkonnen was. If you watch the 80s Dune, I don't know, 83, 84, I forget what year it came
84,
out.
yeah.
84. If you watch Lynch's Dune, Baron Harkonnen is kind of like this buffoon. He's a bad guy, obviously, but he's not menacing. He's not terrifying. He's like laughable. And I think that's kind of what Lynch was trying to do. But if you watch, Stellan Skarsgård as Baron von Harkonnen, you kind of get that sense that you get in the book, that foreboding. This guy's a monster. He's capable of, absolute evil, and that's something that I thought that this movie that Villeneuve did a really good job. The Sardaukar, just how menacing and wicked the baddies in this movie actually comes across in a way that was just kind of cartoony in the first one.
We're introduced to the Sardaukar with their being anointed with the blood of defeated foes on their foreheads.
Or it
something
could
like that.
Could be, I think, possibly sacrifice their own from among their own ranks, or maybe they were captured. I don't recall. There's a lot of hallmarks in the film that Villeneuve used that aren't in the book. He takes some liberties, mostly visual moments and these aesthetic choices that are really clever and fit into Herbert's work, but aren't, nodded to or acknowledged in the book. There's the Sardaukar throat singing, which became kind of like a popular, sort of became a meme.
Yeah.
That's not in the book, but it's sort of like you understand, okay, this warfare is the religion of these guys, right? Or the Atreides house having the bagpipes and having this sort of like, it's like sort of Scottish iconography. again, not in the books, but you kind of get the sense it's like, oh, that's a thing that's connecting to them to the earth of the ancient past, just these little choices that Villeneuve made that
the bullfighting, but that's not a Villeneuve choice. That's from
that is in the book. That is in the book.
It does tie it to like ancient earth.
There are certain little liberties he takes where, and again, Frank Herbert threaded all kinds of things, particularly things like, Middle Eastern culture. There's all kinds of, rich with that. But there's all kinds of things in the book that are maybe hinted at that Villeneuve really sinks his teeth into. And I thought that was very cool. He's clearly a guy who's like, loves these books, is obsessed with these books. This isn't a guy who's like, acquired the rights and is, sort of thinks of the book as like, okay, I'll just kind of riff on this. This is a dude who clearly is, has a true love for the source material.
He doesn't look at the source material as an IP to be mined. It's something that he actually cares about. And if you watched any of the press that he did for this, he kept referring to it as his Bible.
Yeah.
When they would ask him, did you go to the 1984 Dune, or did you try to find the Jodorowsky Dune book? And he's no, none of that. Is like, that's all fine. The book itself was the Bible, and I always had a copy of it. And anytime I just hit a wall, I would open it up and find the inspiration. The answer was always right there. Yeah, the Sardaukar, completely scary. Just Baron Harkonnen, just a nightmare. Another thing that he added, and I'm a little confused about this one, is the little spider pet. That's not in the novel.
The spider in the film, absolutely not in the text. But some people have said it could be him alluding to foreshadowing something we could see in the next one. Some of the genetic engineering that happens in that universe or something. And some people are like, you just wanted to put a weird, creepy spider pet in it.
Sure. The script is out there on the internet, and when that moment comes, it describes the creature as a latex spider human hybrid.
Yeah, it's sort of like a BDSM spider person pet.
I want to talk about the editing in this movie a little bit. Really interesting choice that they made with this one. And what I mean is, this was edited by Joe Walker, who also doubled in the movie. He was the voice of the book, the little docu-book that
Oh, right.
It's telling young Paul about the savage Fremen. Yeah, that's the editor, Joe Walker. There's a lot to communicate to the audience. And this movie is a good 2 hours, 35 minutes long. And there's a lot to tell the audience. And they don't really use exposition dumps.
No, I do think that those narrated moments you just mentioned, they're sort of a good way of injecting that knowledge without it feeling too forced. Yeah.
We first see these weird little moments pop up when Lady Jessica tells Paul, make me give you the water. Make me give you this glass of water. Use the voice on me. We see her reach over and slide the glass over to him. But then he uses the voice, and then we see it actually happen, which made, I was like, what is that? She gave it to him, but then that was happening in her head. That was her picturing him doing that. And then he actually did it. I didn't pick it up until like the third time I watched it. Then later on, it happens when he uses the voice. We see something happen before it happens. And that's actually communicating to us, these are Paul's visions. This is going on in Paul's head. And some of this stuff's going to happen and some of it's not.
Right.
It's never laid out. No one ever just puts that in plain English. You just have to kind of pay attention to the editing and what the editing is trying to show you.
And sort of his visions of the Holy War. I like how that was sort of stitched in at one point, or the visions of Lady Jessica. Once she becomes the Bene Gesserit leader within the Fremen people, you just sort of see those brief telegraphed moments, and again, and also like when Paul when his foot hits the sand on Arrakis, and you kind of see inside his head for a moment. You see him experiencing like his first taste of spice, sort of awakens that ancient memory in him and everything. Sort of those subtle moments that are threaded in there, I think, are really subtle. It's like you said, there's no exposition dumps. Again, sort of with the whatever you want to call it, like his sort of encyclopedia of the knowledge that's instilled in the little device or whatever.
You kind of get Hitchhiker's Guide.
Sort of a Hitchhiker's Guide. You get those moments, and that's obviously for the benefit of the audience. But him getting it as sort of a student on this planet, it works. It's not voiceover. They didn't include Princess Irulan at all, and she's sort of a Greek chorus in the books to some extent. In David Lynch's version, she pops up. Now, of course, Florence Pugh is currently in talks to play Princess Irulan in the second installment, which is great casting, I think. But yeah, she's not used as sort of that. Because there's a quote from some of her text at the beginning of each chapter in Dune that sort of points you in the direction where this is going. It's a lot of exposition. It's a lot of sort of foreshadowing, but we don't have any of that. Villeneuve didn't use that at all in this film.
I appreciated that. I kind of like it when, and sometimes you don't really realize that they're showing you this stuff, or your brain is noticing stuff that you maybe aren't. Your conscious self isn't really noticing.
And also, I like. I think there's a little bit of an obsession with the fan service Easter egg thing, particularly in sci-fi, particularly in IP used before these days. That we all think it's fun to pick up on something that we know that maybe not everybody does. It's a fun thing, but I think that it's kind of becoming a crutch in a lot of like the Marvel and Star Wars stuff, where it's like, oh, that's a reference to this from the comics. Oh, that's a reference to the previous film version of this. And he's not doing that. He's not laying out tons of little things for you to go, oh, but it's just enough, sort of like the desert mouse, that of course being a reference to Paul being the Lisan al-Gaib, I think is how you say it, the mouse of the desert or whatever. So there's like much more subtle references than rather just laying a fat Easter egg for us all to go, oh, that was in the book.
So the differences from novel to movie, do you have any of them that just stand out as being particularly not egregious, but
prominent?
Yeah.
I would say the absence of a couple of characters that are very obviously going to be included in part 2. But I think Villeneuve did that to keep from overburdening, kind of weighing us down in this first one. We don't see Princess Irulan at all. But yeah, I think that Villeneuve kind of had to peel away some of the narrative layers just because it would be sort of too overwhelming to get into 2.5 hours.
Sure.
And there's this sort of subtle elements and turns that are just sort of snipped out. I think that's just sort of the nature of movie making. You can't be inside a character's head. And if you don't want to use narration and voiceover for the most part, you're going to lose all of that stuff. You have to show rather than tell, right? So I think a lot of the differences between the book and this version are subtle enough that none of them feel that impactful. None of them feel like that big of a difference. I think he was really interpreted as pretty much as faithfully as you really can while still doing your own thing.
Yeah, it's a fine line to walk for a filmmaker when you adapt something, especially something that's as rabidly beloved by its fans.
Yeah, and Lynch did something pretty different where he injected his own weird sci-fi elements that weren't at all in the books. The guild navigators have their saying. It's kind of like the Litany of Fear, but it's different, where they have this thing that they acquire the stains, blah, blah, blah. It's this thing that they say. And I remember expecting to come across that in the book because I watched the Lynch version first and I never found it. And then looked it up. And sure enough, that was something that Lynch came up with himself, or what the guild navigators looked like.
You have to change it enough because, of course, film and books, they're two different mediums, each with its own strengths, its own weaknesses. You want to play to that. And you don't want to be a slave to what's written down also. You can't change it too much, but on the other hand, if you just shoot what's in the book, that doesn't necessarily make for good cinema. Like, he got the spirit of it right, and he got the broad strokes correct, and you make a few changes here and there. He's buffed up a few of the female characters, gave them more complete arcs.
And he made Liet Kynes a woman in the film.
He gender swapped that character, which, that's all fine. That's, gender swapping and stuff. I mean, unless it's, I can't even think of a reason why not to. I was going to come up with some obvious reason not to, but really, I don't care. I mean, they could have made Paul a woman, as far as I'm concerned. It wouldn't. I guess it would have affected the whole Bene Gesserit situation.
Yeah, there are rules within the universe that are based on biological sex, and a lot of people have talked about there's problematic nature of the depiction of women, and maybe sort of his use of certain themes that could be linked to sort of ethnicity and that sort of thing. And
colonization. There's
well, I mean, and the whole book is, is commentary on colonization and all manner of things. And Frank Herbert was a pretty progressive guy in a lot of regards. But, there needed to be more representation. I'm glad that there are a lot of people of color in the movie. I'm glad that I'm glad that Leah Kynes was cast as a woman, and there's not quite so many gender roles set within the universe that he created. I think he brought it into the 21st century in a way with this adaptation. That's pretty cool. There's little tweaks here and there, but I think that Villeneuve is clearly so obsessed and in love with the source material and with Frank Herbert that it seemed like he was, it would be sacrilege to interpret it, to go too far afield with anything. It has his visual imprint on it. It's like you were saying, he's so good with scale, with scope, and Blade Runner 2049 and an Arrival, just putting yourself in these scenes. I just love living inside of his movies, the visual world of his movies, that he was able to put that stamp on Dune without changing the subject matter.
It's nice to see him branch out and make a movie that's not rated R. Like, kids can go see this movie and that's fine. It's the very first one. Most of his movies have very serious, heavy subject matter. And this one, there's blood and people die and so forth, but it's not Prisoners level.
Oh, well, sure.
We don't have that scene with Hugh Jackman and the hammer.
It's, but also it's funny, of course, now if this had come out when I was a 12, 13-year-old, of course I would have tried to see it. But I also don't know how many 10, 11, 12-year-olds are going to sit through a nearly 3-hour, space epic. Maybe, I don't know, maybe some. But yeah, just the nature of the subject matter, it's adult, but it's not like prohibitively so or anything,
I'm sure some people that age would probably consider this movie boring. In fact, people my age consider the movie boring.
I've heard that from some folks. It's if it just ain't your thing, it ain't your thing. And if your primary touchstone when it comes to sci-fi films are Star Trek or Star Wars, it's not action packed like that. I mean, no. There are, of course, there are battle scenes and all that, but it's not paced that way. And it was never really supposed to be.
And I love the fact that this movie it reminds me of Star Wars, not in the obvious ways where George Lucas took his obvious influence from Dune in several ways. But it reminds me of the original Star Wars trilogy in that it's a personal story and the effects are there to serve that, period. They're not there to dazzle you, even though some of it is dazzling or was by those standards of the day. But that's all just the backdrop to this very personal story that he's telling. And that's what this Dune is. It's a very personal story. It's someone who's politically and religiously extremely important to the galaxy. But at the same time, it's about him. It's about his relationship to his mother and his father, and now to the Fremen and to the planet itself, but also like just the sheer scope. This movie exists in gigantic wide shots and in extreme close-ups, and there's not a whole lot of in between. I thought that was a great choice. We have to give you the big shot of the gigantic sphere ship that comes down with the Imperial
Highliners. I think they're called.
So awesome looking, so cool looking.
Yeah.
But also, a lot of the dialogue plays out in extreme close-ups. Like we're right up in Timothée Chalamet's face.
And it's a very beautiful cast too. There's everybody's lovely to look at in this movie, and fascinating looking and just great on screen. They all have powerful presence on screen. But Denis Villeneuve, and obviously I haven't met the man or been on set or see how he works one-on-one, obviously. But people kind of say that George Lucas famously isn't really an actor's director.
Right.
Obviously, he's not very great with dialogue, right? He's a big picture kind of guy, big ideas. But Denis Villeneuve manages to be both sort of a big picture visual guy and an actor's director, from what I can tell. I mean, every film, and part of it's by virtue of how good the performers are he gets in it. I mean, Amy Adams is one of my favorite actors of all time. Ryan Gosling's incredible in Blade Runner 2049. The whole cast of Dune is really, really good. So it's kind of hard to go wrong when you have casts this strong. But, these moments feel like intimate moments. They don't feel like a soundstage 16th take okay, we had to ADR it because there was set noise or whatever. It feels like, man, this could be like a chamber piece. Like this moment between these two characters, it's something to latch onto too. And some of the people I know who saw the movie who aren't familiar with the book, don't really care about the universe or whatever, liked it because of the narrative tension or the performances or how good Sarsgaard is, and how creepy he is, and how incredible Zendaya looks. A lot of people that weren't familiar with the book, I think, were like, well, what the hell? Zendaya's in all the promotional materials, and she's supposed to be the co-star, and she's in this movie for like 13 minutes. I'm like, well, wait for part two. Wait for part two.
I was just about to bring up that very issue. I heard several people complaining, like, well, she was barely in the movie. Like, well,
she's sort of the pivot point for Paul, and everything sort of, without giving anything away, there's a push and pull for him with what his path is calling him to do as a very integral part of the human race's survival, and then what he as an individual feels and is feeling for Chaney. And that's sort of the internal struggle of what I think we'll see a lot of in the second one, is his feelings for her and the Fremen and the planet itself, and then his calling to sort of, at the center of the universe, literally be the leader of the human race.
I think we're pretty much tapped out. I think I am anyway. How about you?
I mean, to be honest with you, I could probably talk about Dune all day long, but I'm not sure anybody needs to hear hour 7 of my Dune takes. But yeah, extremely, very much looking forward to the next one.
Couple of years out, right? About a year and a half away, closer to 2 years. October 2023.
October 2023. Yeah, so year and a half from now.
Do you have anything you want to plug before we wrap it up?
We'd love it if people read the Nashville Scene, support local media, support alt weeklies. We're out there every week for free, covering the news and arts. And yeah, just appreciate anybody who reads local news.
Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jason. I'll probably rewatch the movie again, I don't know, tonight, tomorrow night.
Yeah, do it, man. It's great. Thanks, Patrick. Take care, man.
Thanks, buddy. Mm-hmm.
Later. And that's it. That does it for the episode, and that does it for Season 3. I'd like to thank my guest today, Patrick Rodgers. You can find him on Twitter. That's at @DPatrickRodgers. That's Rodgers with a D, Rodgers. And while you're at it, go ahead and follow the Nashville Scene. That's at Nashville Scene. You can find us on Instagram at Filmography_Club_podcast. Give us a follow there, and while you're at it, feel free to give us a rating, maybe leave a review if you're feeling generous with your time. I'd like to thank Michael Eads, Will Fox, and Ross Warner. Filmography Club is produced by the hardworking folks that we own this town. For Filmography Club, I'm Jason Cavanis. Thanks for listening.